A Minecraft movie. The experience of watching a Minecraft movie in a cinema was one I felt I could reasonably cleanly divide into two segments. My consumption of a movie utilising themes, ideas, props and concepts from Minecraft, though twisting them somewhat to fit its narrative, and a societal commentary, one that displays how the systems it discusses have their emotional impacts on the characters and how they must work together in highlight of their differences to overcome the subsequent oppression. Oh, and let's not forget the children behind me so incessantly repeating the meme parts. But this isn't so generic as you might expect. It's one thing for a film to intertwine these themes of togetherness and expression, but another to weave them so deeply into the plotline and, rather hard-hitting for me, display the effects on the characters and their bonds with each other. The play opens with a sort of lens, an insight, one could say, into the life of a struggling doorknob salesman called Steve. Bored stiff of his job in an office, he returns to his childhood dreams of yearning for the mines and is able to fight past another individual who wants to keep him out. In this mine, he discovers an orb of dominance and the earth crystal, two elements he rather comically individually describes as thingies. When the orb is placed inside the earth crystal, a portal between the real world and the Minecraft overworld is created. This portal transports Steve to the overworld, in which he quickly learns that the terrain is made of cubes he can easily manipulate. Despite his initial fears, he learns to carve out his own existence and identity in the overworld, though expresses that he grows fearful of nighttime. We then see Steve hiding in the corner of his homemade shack-like house from familiar monsters at the window. It doesn't take him long, though, to stumble upon a ruin, from which he's able to assemble a portal to the Nether, a node to the game's mechanics, of course. In the Nether, our explorer Steve meets a weird pig ruler who holds a disdain for creativity and an unquenchable lust for gold. Gold, 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 declared Malgosia, and no creativity, for that disrupted the gold mining work of her piglin army. Malgosia has Steve imprisoned because the orb would allow her forces to control the overworld. Steve has his dog Dennis hide this orb and its accompanying crystal, from what I can remember, under his bed in the real world. This sets up the foundations on which the Minecraft movie is to take place. I initially found myself fairly critical of this actually. It felt like an entire plotline of a movie had been squished down and almost condensed into a single introduction, yet I found myself quite aware of how far-fetched it all seemed. But I'd soon learn that these foundations played pretty key roles in the story to follow. We then meet our third main character, or fourth if you count that dog. Garrett the Garbage Man Garrison, owner of a failing video game store in Chuglas, Idaho, and seemingly proudly so. In an auction, he wins the contents of the real-world house in which Steve lived, but instead of the Atari Cosmos he was hoping for, he instead finds the Orb of Dominance in the Earth Crystal, in which he perceives no value, of course. He discards this as junk, and we later find out that it's on sale in his shop for about $9.50 or something. Next, we meet Natalie and Henry, two siblings moving to Chuglas following the death of their mother. The latter character, Natalie, presumably the older of the two siblings, is elected to take care of Henry. Natalie makes Henry a dish their mother would provide the pair when she was alive in hopes that Henry could share it at school. But Henry declines, instead expressing an interest in being perceived as normal. He's teased and ridiculed for his desires to become a rocket scientist, largely by two bullies at this school. Believe it or not, these appear only sparsely throughout the entire film, sort of as bookends, appearing towards its start and very briefly at its end. And these aren't the forces of oppression and systematic unifying I find more central to the storyline. Anyway, not too long later, aiming to prove his abilities and willingness to chase his goals, our apparent protagonist Henry crafts a jetpack, but it's sabotaged by the two bullies. As so many present await its takeoff, I, as an audience member, figured it would be the usual case that no, the jetpack wouldn't take off and he would have to face the ridicule, yada yada yada, but no. The system does indeed take off, but it flies into a statue of a mascot on a nearby shop, in which his sister, the one taking a parental role for him, seems to be present. In response, the school has Henry in a meeting. An individual appearing to be a head teacher of some kind requests Henry phones his parents or guardian in relation to what's happened. Henry contemplates, but ultimately cannot bring himself to fess up to Natalie. Instead, he offers to pay the dude who runs the local video game shop, Garbage Man, to pretend to be his uncle for the school. Afterwards, Henry and Garbage Man meet inside the shop, combine the orb with its crystal despite its explicit instructions not to, and subsequently they open up a portal to the overworld. Before going in to explore, the two are eventually found by Natalie and a companion of hers named Dawn, who had tracked Henry's location via his phone. The four are ultimately dragged from the real world into the overworld by Henry's unwillingness to let go of the crystal. What does this mean? The orb and the crystal have been returned to the overworld. Malgosia is alerted to this, and releases Steve on the condition that he retrieves the orb for her. She bluffs that she holds his dog hostage in exchange for the orb. Back to the four then. Henry, Natalie, Dawn and Garbage Man are now united, and they foster some interesting bonds with one another. Garbage Man sticks out like a sore thumb with the femboy initiatives he reveals earlier. Dawn reckons him an idiot. Natalie is angered by Henry's actions, and Henry seems more open to the new world the four find themselves in. Subsequently, Henry saves everyone's balls by building a fortress with the overworld's easily manipulatable terrain that we discussed earlier. The four are in a fight with various types of mobs as the sun fell, but despite the best efforts of all four, they're ultimately saved by a mysterious force. This is revealed to be none other than Steve himself. Steve has grown accustomed to this new way of life, this new world, embraced the creativity necessitated to survive in it, and ultimately acts as a tour guide for the four in explaining its ins and outs. Natalie expresses that she just wants to leave and get her brother home and safe. She promised her mother she'd keep him safe after all. So, Steve strikes a deal with the four. The Earth Crystal had been destroyed in the commotion, but Steve wants his dog back, so wishes for the orb in exchange for helping the four escape. Steve joins the four in their journey to a village, from which Steve demonstrates how to gather resources for survival. However, Malgosia and her piglin army from before are alerted to the presence of the orb, so the army is sent to the village to seize it. The characters all narrowly escape the raid, but Natalie and Dawn are separated from Steve, Henry and Garrett. As an added condition for handing back the orb, Garrett is overcome by a lust for Steve's stash of diamonds once hearing of it. The journey through Steve's mines is interrupted by another interjection from the piggies, namely a great hog, released in response to the failure of the village raid, and it almost renders the three killed in an admittedly rather tense moment. Meanwhile, Natalie and Dawn discover Dennis, Steve's dog. Ultimately, Malgosia's goals become even more clear. She's willing to shed the world of creativity to make way for her gold mining efforts. In a devastating scene, we see a pig's performance in a talent show ridiculed ruthlessly by Malgosia. Malgosia insists the smaller, younger pig grow up and mine for gold. This is not the first time we see such a thing happen. Malgosia ridicules a young pig's drawing, teasing it, but concluding it wouldn't really help the youngling mine for gold, thus declaring it useless. So, I think this is reasonably where I can leave the plot. At least for now. This plot is somewhat complex, what is effectively still going to be considered a kid's film, but it's nothing extreme. It's not something I think many would consider exactly groundbreaking. However, I feel there's something to be said for the different roles that these characters play inside of the story. So, let me get one thing straight, right? Garbage Man is a loser. And that's not just me saying that. The vibes were fun, but I feel like his initial presentation is designed from the ground up to make him present awfully loser-like. In attempting to deliver life advice to Henry, he presents us with some semi-coherent babble about truly being oneself or something, but does so like some hardened, hairy, middle-aged man who you know almost for definite watches Hello Kitty or something in his spare time, no judging. He additionally says, "Listen kid, there's no I in team, but there's two in winning." As I touched on earlier, he confesses his femboy urges in the film, but ultimately I think we are to perceive him as a man who feels he's failed. His once successful video game shop had now been failing for years, and his lack of success since his 1989 victory of Gamer of the Year seems to have left him a desperate man, craving validation and reaffirmation from his companions. In his introduction to Dawn, he states, "Garrett the Garbage Man Garrison, Gamer of the Year 1989, whatever, I barely think about it." In such introductions of himself, he's startled when the other characters don't seem to have heard of him from this achievement. He later confesses when Henry deems him a bad person for his apparent selfishness, greed and fabricated personality that, yeah, he is indeed a loser and is not doing well, despite what his masking of his emotions may suggest. He shows us as an audience a man ultimately crippled by his disappointment in himself, but one willing to paint a new existence to cover this up. Henry carries some tropes of your typical movie school bully victim. When you're introduced in his responses to the bullies, you pretty much know exactly what you're in for. He engineers, he crafts, and his creativity is ultimately what put them all in this mess in the first place. But this leads me to the individual who is absolutely my favourite character of the entire film, Natalie. Natalie is so interesting to me. She goes out of her way to criticise Henry's oddities and his creativity and ingenuity by explaining to Garbage Man, who is encouraging it, that it's what gets him bullied and causes all of this chaos that they all find themselves in now. However, throughout the film, Natalie seems to come to terms with the idea that Henry's creativity isn't at fault, only the systems in which Harry resides that sabotage it, hamstring it, and ultimately suppress it. In quite the emotional twist, Natalie eventually apologises to Henry and makes up with her brother. now more understanding of Henry's creative tendencies after spending time in the overworld fending from the piglins. This is where Natalie's art gets even more interesting. She becomes an absolute icon in my eyes very quickly, manifesting a diamond sword from the resources at hand and becoming honestly a key player on the battlefield against the piglins in this grand final fight. Once she lets her creativity flow free, she plays a core part of what makes the team unstoppable. Speaking of, I find it interesting how the team is presented and specifically how this juxtaposes with the army of the opposition. The pigs, they're monotonous almost in presentation, if that makes sense. They're all of one shade, one form, seemingly one attitude, almost a hive mind, so to speak, yet they're presented to be dim-witted. Malgosha ridicules the group for their construction of plentiful iron golems to aid them in the final fight against the piggies, explaining that they shan't attack until provoked. What does the piglin do? Shoot one. Genius. I suppose this shows where such cockiness gets one. The team, however, while bonded by the efforts of teamwork, do not form such a blob of sameness. Instead, all of their differences are simply highlighted in how they overcome obstacles and eventually triumph over the piglins. All being more or less identical, the piglins share weaknesses, whereas the collective differences of the group end up having them win out over the oppressive army. Crucially to me, while all 5 of them put their hands together before the fight, they all shout something different after Steve's countdown. If I recall correctly and heard properly, Natalie shrieked teamwork, Steve yelled Minecraft, among other suggestions appointed. Steve initially insists that they all do it once more, and all yell Minecraft in unison, but instead concludes that the group has no time. Not only does this make for a comedic twist, somewhat iconic in how tongue-in-cheek it feels to me, it symbolises fairly well to me how all 5 of the individuals in question arrive on the battlefield with their respective strengths, all of which end up seeming to cover for each other in the fight that we witness. In addition, the iron golems constructed towards the beginning of the fight end up more or less saving the humans in their eventual collection of the orb from the Grand Hog, who seized it in quite the worrying turn for the 5 and the audience. Despite their initial differences and continued disagreements, Garbage Man ultimately saves Henry from being doomed to fall, with a ghast from the Nether that now seems to be happy and cooperative after being freed from the grip of the Nether and its unified piglin army, and presumably their unwavering quest for gold and nothing else. Now, the arcs of the characters are interesting. I've already touched on Natalie being my favourite character, but I just want to go back here just for a quick sec. I find Natalie's place in this so notable because she's initially less accepting of the ideas Henry seems more keen to follow, but eventually she learns to push past this skepticism of hers for the benefit of all the individuals in the group, including herself. She's forced, in this new world she finds herself in, to do away with her previous ways of being overly protective of Henry and thus possibly critical of his creativity. Instead, she must take the reins and quit cowering. She must take it to battle, and I think she knows that. I think she realises that. However, we can't help but empathise with her greatly, at least in my experience. After Garrett's rude comment about how he's been a better sister than she ever was to Henry, we see the devastation in Natalie. She feels she's failed her brother, and as such, her mother. For all this time, though, she's only ever tried her best to protect him from the bullies and oppressive forces. Now, as someone who was bullied, for expressing myself, sharing how I was, this does hit home in particular for me, I think, because there were lots of parties that advised that I rein it in and hide parts of myself. And sure enough, these were parties that later on did indeed feel guilt for recommending this, because they only wanted to protect me, but I lost myself in wearing an identity that just wasn't really me. Natalie tries to warn Henry that the creativity as he demonstrates in the overworld won't fly in the real world, to which Henry retorts that maybe the real world just isn't for him then. Natalie is ultimately forced to step outside of her comfort zone, but I feel she knows it's for the good of creativity and ultimately in the best interests of her brother. She steps outside of her comfort zone as an effort to try to understand the deviation from an oppressive system. She steps outside of her comfort zone to, yes, take on a force trying to purge a world of creativity in favour of chasing gold. And honestly, that deviance is something that I respect. She didn't feel very comfortable at the start, but she warmed up to the idea and realising that no, the problem is not creativity. The problem is that we as a world are being funneled into doing something that we might not want to do, leading an existence that we don't necessarily want to lead. Now, how all of this ties into the real world then? We live in a world, I feel, that's rather objective. We work to get paid, and we do what gets us paid well. If we want to do something different, tough. If we do it in class, we're not even told to pursue it outside of maths class, we're just told to stop, just pack it in.
The beauty in what we create isn't seen because it doesn't contribute to some big idea about making money or being successful or getting good grades so we can be successful. We're being actively shoehorned into existences in which we just don't really feel we fit, but the movie proposes an alternative to me. It poses we, by the end, build our overworld. As the film concludes, Steve, after previously being adamant he wished to stay in the overworld due to its creative liberties, gives in to the temptation to join the others in the real world. He ventures into the real world to share his creative energies there, regardless of the opposition. This very much juxtaposes with the idea that Henry doesn't belong in the real world because of his outlandish creativity. Steve is then showing it willing to face the oppression of the real world and flourish his creative wings regardless of its critique of how they don't contribute to wealth. As a side effect of this, of course, success manifests anyway. Natalie, she becomes a survival guide, a skilled trainee. Garrett's business takes off again. Henry is seen soldering around game consoles, fulfilling his dreams by the looks of things. All of this is achieved simply because the individuals must learn that they must flourish their creative wings in the face of a critique. Now, this is not necessarily a unique message for a film, I get that. I take interest, though, in the fact that the piglins represent an oppressive society in which the one concern is literal gold. If that's not representative of capitalism, I'm not too sure what is. Creativity is shredded in favour of reaching this objective goal. In this, talent is shredded, as we see with the talent show incident, in which the contestant is shamed extensively and just told to grow up and find gold. Failure is punished ruthlessly, as we see in Malgosha literally publicly executing the leader of the village or braid for his failure, and any deviation or divergence from this regime, this ultimate goal of gold, is frowned upon and punished in one way or another. However, Natalie is forced to play an offensive role in tackling these issues, rather than a defensive one. Rather than staying safe and staying in the boundaries and confines set up by oppression, she must instead fight it. And the collective energies of all the five, and heartwarmingly the iron-constructed friends, ultimately take precedence in dethroning the Piglin army and restoring safety to creativity once more. I believe that the message is not necessarily just to express yourself or what have you. It's a message telling us that sometimes offence is a good defence, and we must work hard to preserve our creativity by perhaps sharing it with the world, rather than just preserving it for ourselves. For we're stronger when these creative powers are united.